And so this evening, we're gonna do some travel through space and time, going halfway around the world, and also 20 years of time. So all the way from the corner of your living room or your office or wherever your computer might be. We arrived in the United Arab Emirates in late July of 1998 as founding faculty of a new university called Zayed University. And this university was established by the UAE as an English medium university for local Emirati women. It had two campuses, one in Abu Dhabi and one in Dubai, where my husband Seth and I both worked. And there were about 800 students on the Dubai campus. And we see in the bottom right-hand corner a typical science classroom. There's Professor John Burt up front with some of the students, and Seth is in the way back of the room at his research bench. Just a few words about John Burt. He arrived with us in 1998 as a fresh 23-year-old professor with a master's degree in science and a boatload of curiosity and enthusiasm. More about John later. So here, to give you the setting of this story, the UAE borders Saudi Arabia and Oman. It's across the Arabian or Persian Gulf from Iran. The land mass is about 32,000 miles, which is more or less the size of South Carolina. And the population in 1998 was about 3.1 million people. By 2020, there was 9.6 million people. So that's tripled in 20 years. Politically, it's a federation of 7 states. Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Sharjah, Ajman, Al Quwain, Ras Al Khaimah, and Fujairah. And it has a coastline of about 819 miles. And the Straits of Hormuz are at the very corner of the country here. Ecologically, the country can be divided into 3 different types of regions: the desert, which covers 80% of the landmass, the mountains, and the marine coastal areas. And they're blessed with 7% of the world's oil reserves, but very, very little water. There are no lakes, and there's no freshwater rivers. As for climate, there's 2 seasons in the UAE: beastly hot and just simply warm. And the hot season lasts from about April to October. And the hottest months, July and August, the average maximum temperature can be up to 122 degrees. In July, or on July 22nd, 1998, when we first arrived in the country, at midnight, it was 95 degrees. So walking outdoors and shopping was really only possible at night. It was really, really hot. Even at night, it stayed hot. The warm season, in contrast, which started late October, early November, and goes until March, has daily highs of 70 to 80 degrees and nighttime lows of 60 degrees, so it's quite comfortable. Anytime that there was snow on the ground here in Vermont, it's perfectly comfortable in the UAE. Precipitation gets less than 5 inches of rain per year, 5 inches of rain per year in the coastal areas, but the air is humid and there's 50–60% humidity. So it's really can get really uncomfortable if you're outdoors during the hot season. There's 14 inches of rain a year in the mountains, so it's quite a bit more. And most of that rain occurs in January, however. This is all vitally important for camping because in the summer it's lethally hot. And we would basically just estivate, which estivates is kind of like hibernating, but it's hiding from the hot weather and the humidity rather than cold temperatures. From November to March, however, the temperature was ideal for camping. And camping trips would hardly ever get rained out. Well, hardly ever. Our first trip, when we first arrived in the country, we'd been there working hard for about 4 weeks, and the head of the English department at the university persuaded her husband, Sandy, to head a trip out into the wadis, and wadis are dry riverbeds. And she told him, hey, it's the end of August, it'll be cool enough. And Sandy, despite his misgivings about the weather, said, okay. So we got together a carpool with fellow faculty who had 4-wheel drives and headed out into the wadi. So what is a wadi? It is a riverbed. Often it's dry. Maybe it has pools or connected puddles of water in it. Sometimes an oasis gathers around a wadi. Because of the water, it becomes the center of all life in the region. And we wouldn't really come to appreciate how special a wadi is until much later. Some people would call this kind of driving Wadi Bashing, off-road exploration of maybe drivable or maybe not so drivable trails or just simple dry riverbeds. But it was important to really pay attention to where we were driving because we didn't want the Wadi Bashing to be bashing up our cars or any of the natural environment. One of the first things we saw when we got out to that wadi that first day were these calcite terraces. And these are holding water and there's several inches between levels. And this was a natural phenomenon. And that young guy who just arrived, John Burt, was just fascinated. He said, wow, this is really, really cool. And this became one of the starts of his first research projects in the Emirates. Unfortunately, that day, not everyone in the group was able to see the terraces. Some of the people in the group were melting in the sun. And August, even late August, is way too hot to be outdoors in the Emirates. Our trip leader, Sandy, was a doctor, and he recognized that some of the people in the group were melting. They were becoming dangerously overheated, even when they were just sitting in the shade or sitting with the AC on. So he said, hey, we got to get back to the city where it's safe. And the rest of us who had just arrived really didn't appreciate the danger of our situation. Cars can break down, and especially if you're wadi bashing and you're in a remote location over rough terrain, if the car breaks down and the AC stops, that could be curtains. So you just don't want to be out in an environment where you're dependent on AC for survival. And it's better to wait until the weather cools down before heading out into a remote area. But when the weather finally did cool down, it was time to go out. So we wanted to try some desert camping in December and January. The temperature was beautiful, maybe daytime highs in the 70s and 80s. So where to go for camping? There were no informative maps. There was no vehicle GPS at that point. Word of mouth was the only way to find out where the camping areas are. So we would ask other faculty for suggestions on their favorite camping spots and get directions from them. And it might go like this. Okay, take the highway to Hire and go to the broken wall behind the new residential development, and then head west across the desert 10 miles until you see a tree. And so what did the highway look like? Well, The Emirates have built some of the most beautiful roads in the world. These are smooth, flat, fast, dangerously fast. Anyone want to use the chat box to say what's odd about this road? Oh, for me, when I look at this, I see the greenery that's on both sides of the road, and I say, what in the world? You can't grow greenery there without water. So when I look at this road, I say, there's the water. Where the green is, that's the water. So you keep going down the highway and the roads might turn into something like this. And then those beautiful big wide highways can just end in a sand dune with no warning. So you gotta stay on your toes when you're driving. And eventually the roads might turn into dirt. Here we are on the outskirts of Hire, and yeah, there's trees in the middle of the road, the dirt road. They can't cut the trees down because trees are very strictly protected by law, but not from camels. So camels might come by and nibble on the bottom of the trees. And we used to call this the camel haircut because the trees all had, they were all trimmed to wherever the camel reached them, very uniformly. There were certain rules for desert driving. Number one is to always travel in a caravan, and you must have a minimum of at least 2 vehicles, but 3 vehicles is better, especially if you're going through unfamiliar territory or it's really rough going. And rule number 2 is to always carry plenty of water, a minimum of 3 liters of water per person per day, but 6 is better. So what's going on in this photograph? Here, we've just arrived in the desert, and what is she doing? We don't have a flat tire. Learned the very first thing you need to do when you leave the road and the gravel track is to let air out of your tires. You want your tires rather soft, down to about 15 PSI, in order to get good traction on the sand. So once you get all the tires on all the vehicles down to 15 PSI, we're ready to roll into the desert. And there were few to no trails. And the dunes are constantly shifting. So it's very important when we're out there to stop often and reconnoiter, to look where we're going. You never want to drive down a hill blindly. You need to make sure first that the hill is not too steep for your vehicle and that there's a possible exit so that you don't get stuck down in a valley and you can't get out. Also, there's this term dune bashing, which we really felt referred to abuse of the desert and the living things in the desert. So by stopping often to reconnoiter, we could look down over the hill and see whether or not, and make sure that we weren't going to run over any plants or animals. And we would stop fairly often. And one of the big questions was when we would stop is, hey, where are we? Are we still in the Emirates? Or did we slide over into the border to Oman? And here's the border between Oman and the Emirates, at least back in 20 years ago. And then when you're ready to stop for the night, you just find whatever shade you can. And here we are under the shade of a giant milkweed bush, and plunk your tent down wherever you feel like. And maybe in the cool of the evening, you might try a few sports. Some tour companies actually had organized trips out in the desert for sand skiing, but we figured being good Vermonters, we'd save the money and try sand skiing ourselves. And well, the speed wasn't quite as much as what we might expect here in Vermont on snow. So when sand skiing didn't work, we also heard that there was snow skiing at the shopping malls, and people would get in line for hours to go down the slopes inside the shopping malls, but we never tried that. It is rather important to choose your camping space really carefully, because you might end up on a camel trail. When we were out there, 30 camels joined us for breakfast. They were surrounding us on all sides of the tent. One of our favorite places for camping in the desert was a place called Fossil Rock. This destination was about an hour southeast of Dubai and Sharjah. And this is what the highway to Fossil Rock looked like way back then. There was one lane of the, or one direction of the highway was finished. The other, well, they had flattened it out, but they hadn't quite got pavement on it. And you just had to watch out for the camels as we drove down the road. Another name for Fossil Rock, the local name is Jebel Maliha, and this is in the foothills of the Hajar Mountains. There are big dunes on one side, punctuated with these gravelly rock mounds. And the gravelly rock mounds were actually a 70-million-year-old seabed. And we did wild camping here, right underneath Fossil Rock. Now you can't do that because it's an ecotourism site, and they have a regular campground that you pay money for, and a museum, and they even have a gift shop.
Erika, I have a couple of questions for you, if I might interject. Leslie's asking, are these wild camels?
They are not wild camels. They roam free, but they are all the camels are owned by somebody.
And you mentioned a milkweed patch that you were camping in the shade of. So that's a different milkweed species than we have here, is that right?
Yeah, that milkweed is called Calotropis procera. And it's a common milkweed. I've seen it in Martinique. I think it must be common any place where it's really hot.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, great. Thanks for the questions. So here's why Fossil Rock is called Fossil Rock. There's 70-million-year-old marine fossils embedded in the sediment at the very top of that rock, that mound. And it really shows how this area was completely underwater, and not too long ago in the history of the world. So it's this sitting here underneath Fossil Rock is a great place to visualize how water and wind really both serve to shape the landforms of the country. But if you're not doing that, you can always sit back and watch those camels. 178,000 camels roams the country in 2003. And now that's almost doubled to 300,000 camels today. So there are lots of camels, and they are not truly wild, although they roam free. They all belong to someone. They're fed in the mornings and the evenings. They're fed hay, they're fed alfalfa. Sometimes they're even fed alfalfa imported from the United States. So these camels are much beloved, and they are grown for camel meat and for milk and for wool, and especially for racing. However, there are wild animals in the desert. Gerbils. Have you ever wondered where gerbils come from? Gerbils are a rodent species that's very common in Arabia, wild. Gerbils, jerboas, and jerds are all similar, very small mammals, and they roam over the sand at night. Very common in this area are the lesser jerboa, the Cheeseman's gerbil, and the Baluchistan gerbil. And here we would get up in the morning, and this one had circled our tent several times, perhaps many times overnight while we slept. So that was always a fun activity when we were camping, is to go out tracking the next morning. Another activity, after dinner, when we had sat around the campfire and it had, got truly dark, we would go get our UV flashlights and go looking for scorpions. So scorpion hunting was a great sport, just to try to find some scorpions. And the reason for the UV light is that scorpions all glow bright fluorescent green under a black light. So here are two of the most common scorpions that we would find: the Arabian fat-tailed scorpion and the arrow-breasted scorpion. There are actually 6 or 7 common scorpion species in the Emirates. Some scorpions would wander across the sand at night, and we could find them with the UV lights. But most would stay close to their burrows, and we would find them by looking for a shrub and then looking for small horizontal slanted holes underneath the shrubs. The scorpions, they're nocturnal carnivores, so they eat insects and spiders and lizards. And here I really want to say a big thank you to iNaturalist and the identifiers on iNaturalist, because these photos and the other species that I mentioned in this presentation were all identified for me by iNaturalist volunteers some 15 or 20 years after I took the photos. Sometimes I had to wait for 3 or 4 years after posting the photos to iNaturalist to get IDs, especially if I had really bad photos, because I was shooting with film back then. So it was hard to really get feedback on my photos until 2 or 3 weeks later when I got my film developed. But most of the photos that I've posted to iNaturalist have eventually received IDs. And this has enabled me to go back to the internet and learn about these species, many years later. And it also provides very important baseline data. If someone wants to say, okay, what species were roaming the desert here 20 years ago? And here's some proof that I have from my photographs. One of my personal favorite times for desert camping was in the 2 to 5 days right after a rainstorm. And this, keep in mind, a rainstorm might happen only 1 or 2 times a year. So this was a big event, because within a week, all of a sudden the desert wildflowers would pop up from under the sand and start to bloom. So I would go out and get pictures of those blooms. And these plants were all identified for me on iNaturalist by Aisha Thani from Dubai. And I really want to give a big thank you to her for helping me learn these plants many years later. If it was too hot in the desert for camping, another favorite camping area was in the wadis, in the foothills of the Hajar Mountains. Between the towns of Madam and Hatta, just over the border in Oman, were some great camping places. And back then, all we had to do was just wave at the border guards, the Omani border guards, and just keep driving. We didn't even have to stop. And the directions that we got from our friends were, well, you take the highway until it turns to a dirt road. Then you go through the village of El Shawaib and turn left at the goat farm and just keep going. So just as in the desert, it was important to stop frequently and reconnoiter. Hajar, as in the Hajar Mountains, means rock. So these are literally the Rocky Mountains of Arabia. And these Hajar Mountains began forming in the late Cretaceous as the Arabian plate was subducted under the Eurasian plate. Actually, this region is known for abduction, when a piece of the continental crust is subducted under oceanic crust, under oceanic rocks. So it's a pretty rare phenomenon geologically. Sometimes we would drive until we found a shaded spot and set up camp in the cool. We would look for trees, and that might mean water and shelter and cooler temperatures, and maybe even a chance to swim in one of the Wadi Pools. Or maybe a chance to sit and watch the waterfall for hours. And when you're accustomed to the dryness of Arabia, finding a source of natural running water, no matter how small the source, is just simply miraculous and mesmerizing. Wadi Pools are local centers of biodiversity in the desert. Here we can find oleander and various shrubs and grasses and date palms. And in another research project, our friend John Burt went out looking for aquatic macroinvertebrates in 2 wadi systems, and he found 38 different taxa living in these tiny wadi pools. Invertebrates feed the vertebrates, and that makes mammals and reptiles and birds all possible in this dry region. So here's an example of an insect I found flying near the Wadi Pools, and John, of course, found some of the larvae. This was a red-veined dropwing. My picture was kind of small. So to see the detail, I borrowed one from Gareth Yearsley on iNaturalist, and you can see a larger version of what the red-veined dropwing dragonfly looks like. Here are some vertebrates. Selection of Wadi vertebrates. There's a wall lizard, an Arabian toad, and an Oman saw-scaled viper. And again, all of these species were identified for me by iNaturalist volunteers some 15 years after I took the photos. So it's been great being able to learn more about these species later. Some birds that we might find, from the very small birds, like the purple sunbird, which is a bit like our hummingbirds that we see so often here. And here's a photo, a close-up of a purple sunbird from Altaf Hussein Talpur, that you can see what this purple sunbird looks like. Larger birds like the Socotra cormorant, we also found some of those in the wadis. And then our favorite wadi destination was a place called Wadi B, which is in the extreme east of the country. And it's the northernmost reaches of the Hajar Mountains. And these mountains, they formed as the Arabian plate collided with the Eurasian plate again. The present understanding is that these mountains were suddenly uplifted some 3,000 meters within the last 30 million years. So they're roughly comparable in age to our own Grand Canyon in the United States. That is, both canyons developed within the last 70 million years. So they're not ancient, but 70 million years more or less. The peaks in this region range from some 2,400 to 4,500 feet. And these broad, deep canyons, they show evidence that there was once surface water here, but there's very little surface water here now. Those are not rivers running through the bottoms of what should be river valleys. Those are roads. On the other hand, way up high at the very tops of these mountains, when we were hiking around, we found marine fossils. So this demonstrates how even these mountains were once under the sea. The daytime winter temperatures in these mountains range from about 60 degrees to 80 degrees, but it was a lot cooler at night, down into the upper 50 degrees. The mountains get about 7 to 8 inches of rain per year, but most of that occurs in the winter. There was a winding road that threads through the peaks and valleys of Wadi B, with S-curves and steep ascents and steep descents, and it felt a bit like riding the Apt Gap or the Appalachian Gap Road above Mad River Glen, only on dirt and no trees visible. The thing is, well, here again, we could simply pull over at the side of the road and put up our tent wherever we felt like it. Hey, I like this view, let's just park here. And one time when we were camping here beside the road, a local man stopped by and he started talking to us, and he explained that this was his family land. And he said we were quite welcome to camp there. And that was great. Local people were extremely friendly and welcoming. However, this dirt road that I have in the photographs has been replaced by a paved one. And now they get much more traffic, and you get a steady stream on weekends of ordinary cars rather than the SUVs that we had to use to access this area. So rather than the occasional adventurous SUV, everybody's there. So it's no longer as peaceful and quiet as we experienced it. When we didn't camp along the side of the road, sometimes we set up camp in these farm fields just out of sight of the road. And these farm fields were owned by the Shehu tribes, who farmed these fields for wheat and barley in the winter. And then they moved down to the alluvial plains or fishing villages in the summer. And there were no water wells here or accessible groundwater. Instead, they did irrigation by channeling the runoff water from the mountains down into these terraced fields. And for drinking water, they had deep cisterns that they would fill by channeling the runoff water. And the terrace gardens could collect up to 18 inches of water after a single 1 to 2 inch rainstorm. And if you think about it, 8 inches of rain over a year sounds like not very much, but it came over 4 months, so that's 2 inches a month. And that 2 inches a month was enough for a wheat crop. And here, way off in the distance, there's a mountain settlement. And these tiny mountain settlements could only be accessed by really narrow, steep paths. There were some settlements near the fields where we camped, and they consisted of small one-room houses that were only used during planting or harvesting season. So they were really basic. And often in these little settlements, we would find petroglyphs. And the best current estimates are that based on archaeological research, is that the petroglyphs might be about 700 years old. Sometimes we also found pottery shards around the buildings and in the fields. And this appears to be a graveyard beside one of the settlements where we used to camp. But everywhere along the canyon, there was evidence of movement, land movement, and change. How about in this picture? Who sees the water in this picture? Anyone want to unmute and suggest? Does anyone see any water? Okay. The water is where the lumps of green are, the little shrubs on the cliff wall. The water is, when we see lumps of anything green, in this country, green means water. So there must be groundwater being channeled into these small locations through cracks in the bedrock. In order for those shrubs to grow, there has to be water flowing through these rocks. The local people here were and still are goat herders. So goats and donkeys roamed freely through these mountains. And the plants, in order to grow, they needed to be really, really well defended. So they were super, super thorny. Some of the plants that we saw in the wadi were this tree, Moringa peregrina. It's a wadi tree used for house construction, for fuel, for perfume making. Another wadi plant here is the rose of Jericho. And even though this rose of Jericho is a fairly common plant, my photo was the first iNaturalist record in the UAE. So yeah, that was a surprise. And again, many, many thanks to Aisha Thani for identifying these plants for me.
Erika, what's the altitude in this area?
It's about, the top of the peaks were about 2,400 feet.
Thanks.
So yeah. I was really, really interested in lichens when I was there, and I was searching the whole country to try to find some lichens. And finally, I found some at the very top peaks in Wadi B, and I collected a couple samples, and I carefully folded them in paper and brought them back to Dubai, and our house cleaner happened to throw out the samples. So I didn't get any permanent records that I could identify while we were in Dubai, but guess we'll just have to go back sometime. Mountain storms were not uncommon up there in the mountains, especially way up in the peaks. And on occasion, we would get thoroughly drenched as well as chilled when the windstorm would come down and knock down the tent, and then lots of rain, and yeah, hypothermia was a real possibility, believe it or not, on occasion. And then the aftermath, we'd go back to Dubai and have to dry out the tents and our gear, and we would dry out everybody's tents and gear in our apartment because we never got around to furnishing our apartment, so there was a lot of big empty space for us to set up tents in the apartment. The last kind of camping that we did was beach camping. And here we are ushering in the new millennium, January 1st, 2000, on the beach in Dibba, just down the mountains from Wadi B. And if we turn around from that location on the beach and look back towards the mountains, this is the view that we saw. And can anyone spot the water here? Well, there's actually a river. And the river runs through this low spot, and you can see it outlined with the trees. It's not a surface river, but there must be a significant amount of water flowing in this line below the trees in order to have trees growing there. But much closer to Dubai than Dibba was Jebel Ali, which was miles of open beach that stretched all the way from Dubai to Abu Dhabi. And we would camp here in the shoulder season in October and March when it was too hot for desert camping and too hot to go on a long drive. Beach camping at Jebel Ali featured sea breezes and a chance for swimming to cool down, so it was quite refreshing. And maybe some birding, like this western reef heron. In the left, you can almost see the western reef heron in my photo. And here's one by Marina Nikinarova, showing you the actual detail of what a western reef heron looks like, the kinds of birds that we would see there along the shore. To camp at Jebel Ali, we would simply drive down the highway to the end of the development, take a right out onto the beach, drive along the beach, and choose a spot to park and set up the tent wherever we felt like it, right on the beach. Jebel Ali had terrific waters for swimming, but there were also lots of stingrays there. And we were warned when we first arrived that if you're more than shin deep and you can't see the bottom, just bend over and start swimming. Don't walk. Some friends of ours were swimming off Jebel Ali on the beach on a camping trip one day, and we watched as one of them, a big guy, they were a group of people were out in the water about waist high, and one big guy suddenly disappeared under the water. And it took 3 people to drag him back to shore because he had stepped on a stingray, and they had to take him off to the emergency room. So these stingrays, when you step on them, they defend themselves just like a hornet, only with a much bigger sting. In 1998, when we arrived in the UAE, there were 35 species of coral and 100 species of fish at Jebel Ali. There was a heat event due to an El Nino Southern Oscillation, and more heat events since 2000, plus lots of development. And John Burt, that scientist that I showed back on the first slide, has since gotten his PhD, and now he's a world authority on Arabian coral reefs. And he reports that 70% of the corals have been lost in the UAE, and that the UAE reefs are some of the most damaged reefs in the world. The fish stocks are down by 80% since 1978. And the building of the Palm Islands and the world has further degraded the coastal environment. This construction started in 2004, just after we left. Actually, it started just before we left, but it opened in 2004. And these big open spaces along the beach where we used to camp, they are no more. These man-made Palm Islands now sit right where we used to camp. So the end of the camping season would happen in mid-March. Maybe we'd be there on the beach, and suddenly overnight, a shamal, a very hot wind would start blowing off the desert at night. And this would just make it suffocating and lethally hot, even by 8:30 in the morning. We would pack up camp in a hurry and just scurry back to our air-conditioned apartments to estivate until better weather would return next year. So now I bring you back to our home in Vermont. Where is the water here? It's all around us, bringing life. The lakes and the rivers, the trees, the grass, even the clouds in the sky. These trees and grass and flowers that we see around us growing without irrigation grow because water is so abundant here. So we are blessed here in Vermont. Every drop of water is God's blessing. With that, see if there's any other questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Erika. We have a bunch of questions. What language do the locals speak over there?
The locals speak Arabic, and specifically the dialect called Gulf Arabic. The locals make up, at least back then, they were between 10 and 15% of the population within the country. And about 50% of the population was actually from the Indian subcontinent there as guest workers. So the lingua franca, the language used for communication across the entire community, was actually English. The Arabs spoke Arabic, the Indians spoke Hindi and Pashto and Urdu and Malayalam, lots of other languages, but we all spoke English together.
And you spoke a little bit about this in relation to the ocean, but any other changes major changes since due to global warming?
Great question. So of course, the marine environment has been greatly affected by that. Lots of research on how the hot temperatures in the area have continued to degrade the environment for the corals. The desert is getting hotter. I mean, it was already unimaginably hot, and now it's getting hotter. I don't know how this has affected rainfall. An odd thing is that since we left, I think there's been 3 or 4 snowfall events in the mountains in Wadi B, and they had never seen snow in recorded history. So climate change is, many unexpected things can happen with climate change.
The same process for getting drinking water by aluminum manufacturing.
Seth reminds me, in order to get drinking water, they would desalinate seawater, and the extra heat that they would use from the desalination plants would be used for electricity generation that had to be used for something, so that was used for aluminum production.
So they would manufacture aluminum, and a byproduct was distilled seawater for drinking.
Or vice versa. Manufacturing water, and they would get aluminum as a byproduct.
Oh, clever. So since we're talking about industry, did you see any, let's see, Leslie's asking, did you see any oil drilling? What was the oil drilling scene like there?
So most of the oil drilling is in Abu Dhabi, which Abu Dhabi, the Emirate of Abu Dhabi, an emirate is kind of like a state. The Emirate of Abu Dhabi has most of the oil reserves in the country. So most of the drilling was there, but there were some places where we went camping out in the desert where we would see the flares from the drilling operations, oil flares that would light up the night sky. But we didn't get close to the oil operations. There were oil spills while we were there. Some of those beaches, some of our favorite beaches would get covered in oil, and we would have to wait for another season for the oil to get washed out to sea again.
Rika's commenting on just the mountain range there in Wadi B, and wondering, so you said the mountains were about 2,000, 2,400 feet, but could that be meters? Because he was just commenting that those mountains look as though they're so large that the valley floor would be right at sea level in that case.
Okay, so I have 800 to 1,500 meters, or 2,400 to 4,500 feet is what I've read in the references.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, the valleys, I'm guessing, would be well under 400 feet. Yeah, I mean, it was not much of a rise from driving along the coastal roads to get up into the valley floor roads in Wadi B.
Will's asking if there were any feral donkeys that you encountered in the desert.
Will is a very good friend of ours who was camping with us. So I think some of the camping pictures that we showed had Will there. Hi, Will. Great to see you here. Yeah, so there were lots of feral donkeys, both in the mountains and the desert. And
some had bad
yeah.
attitudes.
Sometimes when we were camping, they would come by the campsites and we would have altercations with the donkeys. And Will and his wife had a wonderful little puppy who once got kicked by one of the feral donkeys at a campsite.
Another question about feral ecology, I guess. I noticed a lot of palm trees at the watering holes and that you mentioned or that you showed images of. Are those palm trees native to that area? Is that indeed where palm trees come from?
Yes, absolutely. Those are date palms. And I mean, when we think about the local diet and the foods that the locals ate that were locally grown as part of their traditional culture, dates and camel milk and fish were the three main items on the local traditional diet.
Camel's milk is an acquired taste.
Yeah, camel's milk is definitely an acquired taste, and much as we tried, we never acquired that taste.
Michael's asking if the UAE can grow enough food for their population, or do they depend a lot on food imports?
They are entirely dependent on food imports. They're most things that they have there besides oil are imported. I mean, even as I said, the camels get imported food, dried alfalfa and hay from the United States. The food there came from all over the world. So when we would go grocery shopping, there would be vegetables from India and dried milk products from New Zealand and canned spaghetti sauce from the United States. So just everywhere.
There was some subsidized farms for vegetables.
Yeah, Seth remembers that there were a few farms there that were growing vegetables, and they were subsidized by the government in the hopes that there would be some local food. There were also dairies, some local dairies, but local dairies did not have production that was enough to supply the entire country. So a lot of the dairy products were also imported.
So a follow-up. So before oil, was the population just vastly smaller than it is now?
So before oil, they didn't have all these foreign workers that comprised some 70 to 85% of the population. Before oil, the people, there were pearl divers, there were fishermen, there were camel herders.
8 children per wife.
Yeah, so before oil, the local people had much more agricultural types of work.
And before we transition back to a couple more ecological questions, one more. Priscilla's wondering if you could just talk a little bit about just the government of the UAE in general.
The government of the UAE is quite fascinating. The government, so this is a federation of 7 different emirates, and the federation is led by the sheikh, who is kind of, I mean, like royalty. And he also has a ruling council that is comprised of other sheikhs from all the different emirates. And this government, the first sheikh, the ruling leader of the UAE was Sheikh Zayed. Sheikh Zayed was a much beloved ruler who really came up from being a camel herding family. And when the country came into money through having these oil reserves, Sheikh Zayed said, okay, I need to take care of all of my people. And that's what he tried very, very hard in all of his leadership efforts, was to make sure, first of all, that there was peace among the Emirates. And this was a really difficult thing to do because the Emirates had been trucial states. They had been independent entities, and he tried to, do what he needed to do to draw them together as one unified country. He provided free education from preschool through PhD, graduate level work, free health care, many different social projects, programs to support the Emirati population.
No taxes.
Yeah, there's no taxes in the UAE because of the oil revenue.
Why was Zayed University made?
Yeah, so yeah, Zayed University, where we worked, was a university created just for the local women. And this was so that the local women could stay there and live with their families and get a Western education. The local men, when they graduated high school, they could apply to any university anywhere in the world and the government would pay for their education. The same goes for the girls, but the families weren't comfortable having the girls go off in all corners of the world by themselves. So this university, Zayed University, was created as a Western university, English medium, right there, and they could stay with their families, live at home, and still attend a Western university. And this was all free to the local citizens.
Well, so one last question. If anybody else has any other questions, now is a good time to add it to the chat box. But a question that I was thinking about, is there any sort of land conservation movement there, or any kind of processes, systems, agencies, anything like that around land conservation? Is it a moot point because the population is so small? What does conservation look like there?
That is a great question. There are several preserves and reserves. When we were there, they were just starting a preserve called Baniyas Island. Sir Baniyas Island was off the coast near Abu Dhabi, and at the time we were there, you could only get in through a private flight. I think it was helicopter, or maybe it was a flight, I'm not sure. And this was a place where it was stocked with a lot of threatened and endangered species local to the area. And they would bring water every day to the island because there were no water sources on the island. So the animals on the island were quite dependent on transportation, the water arriving every day. Since that time, the preserve on Sir Baniyas Island is now open for ecotourism, and people can go there and visit. There are several other places like the Fossil Rock that we used to camp at, do wild camping there. Now they have this ecotourism destination there. So the government has started creating some regions that are protected from people visiting, but it's hard to tell, are they protected? Are they created as ecotourism destinations as an idea for bringing in tourism revenues? I don't really know. I'm not, I haven't been there recently enough to know exactly.
Well, I think that, unless I'm missing something, I think that'll do it for the questions. Erika, thank you so much for sharing with us this evening, and Seth in the wings, thank you as well. I guess if folks want to stick around and turn on your microphone and/or camera and say hi and hang out for a moment, you're welcome to. But on behalf of the Nature Center, thanks to both of you. Thanks to everybody for coming out, and we really appreciate it.
Okay.
Thank you,
Sean. Thank you for hosting.
Don't stop sharing.